The function of being able to engage in manipulations of the mind or the chemical reactions in the body generate the pretense of illusion by tapping into the assumption that everything is hallucination anyways. The capacity then bypasses the fraudulent presumption of morality by that example, because replacing the hallucination is just taking an intangible nonsense and changing it out for another intangible nonsense, which then mechanizes the function of whatever they wish as wizards to be able to perfect on their own interest. And to that end, you have the mechanism of their white supremacist communism, which then, under that delusion of humanitarian um, morality or universal morality, generates these fraudulent arguments which have been systemically created and invested into and overpaid for by compromised departments of the government and others to be subsidized in the subversion of the system by the insurrectionist Confederates, which, seeking the use of their criminal extortionary powers, have engaged in the overthrow of the United States, first and foremost by the consistent application of sedition as to block the Constitution from being enforced. And to that extent, they actively engage in the white supremacist communism, which has to be levied through the hate crimes against the general public by the government secrets which have been compromised. To this end, the mechanism actively engages in a fraudulent reality by simulation, and to that end, you generate the pretense of the falsifying of the government records, which permanently reinstates the function that X, Y, or Z is the gimmick or the straw man in all of their arguments. To that end, the thing becomes itself because it was itself. The hate group engaged in the function of loyalty to bigotry manufactures the outcome by the active application of the use of force and the barring of remedies to their criminal spells, which the government of the United States is strictly prohibited from according to the levels of governments, including but not limited to the ones that they would specifically choose, such as the use of the advanced secrets in the intelligence community and military, which would then incorporate themselves inside the sheriff's departments and police offices, which would then consistently enforce the capacity of the illusions so that they can make people guilty without due process, and thus the action of the government making people guilty disqualifies the entire court structure which is being defrauded, which has to be compromised by double agent judges disloyal to the Americans who would intentionally ignore the function that the court is being defrauded in favor of the defense of the spell for the false conviction, nullifying the pretense of due process in favor of the application of process as its own end. And the action of process as its own end generates the strictly prohibited behaviors of using the process in order to change status, which then exhausts the parties in order to prevent them from engage to the legal defenses, which being overly strenuous then collapses them and gets the false conviction. And to this end, you have weaponized the mechanism of the system against its definition and then have materialized the threat to national security by those structures, which have to be examined impartially, which requires the removal of the protections of the misuse of the equipment by those parties, which is actively protected by the sedition, as the intelligence oversight by David Bowles from their estimate is the continuation of the gutted department of the law enforcement and education for Congress would then function at the capacity to have examined and engaged in defense functions of those targeted by these structures, nullifying the racketeering structure from their terrorism. And to this end, the compensation would then be generated in society would be restructured according to the law, and thus the mechanism of the criminals would then become too expensive for them, who would no longer receive the payoffs, and the government would stop tolerating their existence, and thus reintroduce the function of legal society. This is generically known as checks and balances, and to the extent that it actually exists, you actually have the fact that the false pretense of nullifying it, such as executive privilege or unitary executive privilege, which states that the president has the right to keep things private from Congress if they give an order in order to stop Congress from doing its constitutional obligations of oversight of the executive, which is a foundational pretense towards their existence. It is one of their defined responsibilities and duties, qualifying the right to do the office. And to that end, you actively have the censorship in order to protect those functions, which then blocks the functions of the government from being enforced against, and thus you have the mechanism of the seizure, and thus the threats against the judges in order to get the non-white supremacists to comply with the white supremacists generating the house niggers. To this extent, the mechanism does not require the party to be black, Latino, or any other, simply a slave of the white supremacists doing the bidding and being tolerated to keep their position for status and comforts in exchange for servitude to the enemies of their office. If it is offensive for one party to say a thing, it is another offense entirely for the offending party to have engaged in the culture where that is the spoken language. And thus, the function of the Confederates being the foundation of the words themselves becomes the offense and not the ones who point out that that's the thing that's happening, as the use of magic requires spelling and misdefining the words generated off of secret signs and symbols, which then trigger the mechanisms of inversion. You then generate the acknowledgement of the language of the spells, which is derivative of the host nation, which is the Confederacy, which is itself existing or being tolerated to exist, being the offense. And thus, it being the offense generates its own language, and its own language being spoken generates offenses to the triggered parties according to the spell, which then, being acknowledged, makes the making the statement of the thing according to the language offensive, which protects the function of it being the correct spoken word, and thus the engagement of the defense of the spell, and thus the protection of the offense, and thus the function of it is not immaterial to being offensive, but is the materialization that an offense has occurred and thus is perpetrated according to the threats within manufactured according to the use of those words in secret and thus polluted into its alternative cover languages for the manufacture of the spell, and thus the criminalizing of evidence, and thus the defense of the offense. And thus the defense of the offense means there is no offense because the offense is the thing being attacked, and thus cannot manufacture its own argument by the changing of the words. And to this end, the correct examination and investigation materializes that responsibility to do so, and in the investigation of the magic generates the pretense of the dog whistles or the racist dog whistles, which generates the cover narratives for when the Confederacy was gaining momentum, it was engaged in its direct opposition to the Americans, which then lost, and then systematically was being degraded by virtue of engagement of having to be tolerated in collaboration with the Americans, which forced them to fracture into different factions. In order to preserve their culture, they had to engage in dog whistles, which allows for the cover story for their continuation of their cultural bigotry, which then has to be tolerated according to the defamation of the thing, which is the defense of the thing, which is the advantage that they're engaging by secrets and factions, engaging in pincher activities as they pretend to be one thing, which is the mechanism where they engaged in the fraudulent manipulation of the target communities, such as, but is not limited to, the attempt to turn the black community into a bunch of communists under the white supremacist spell, which then turns racism and wokeness into the material same conclusion because they are the victim of a spell being defrauded. Now, take for example the mythology of the vampire under the pretense that they are a part of trigger war, trigger alert for the people who care about how things are pronounced, especially in reference of the wizards, the Carboniferous period of the Earth, which is, according to some documents, a era specifically derivative of insects or giant insects materially controlling the entirety of the world, at which point their giant insects engage in the specializing of the manipulation of biology, which then engages in the parasitic functions such as specialized in insects or parasites connected to insects. As these manipulations and artificial hallucination generators materialize the engagement of their victims, which then can be led in diverse functions, and thus the activity of the generation of the hallucination in favor under the control of the parasite in question allows for the mass distribution of these giant insect creatures to have been able to have functionally controlled all of their victims in the manufacturing of the death. And this being a pretext theory of vampires and demons and the rest of them as extensive hallucinations as the illusionary function of the party being subject to the wizard of the insect, then can dream up whatever it fantasizes about, and it being a chemical reaction is reacting to the specific quantity of each chemical, which would then materialize the variations of each person receiving the sites of the hallucination, which would be specific to them. So you have 10 different people look at the same thing and they'll have 10 different hallucinations, more or less, unless they've been manufactured by the engineering to have similar chemicals, such as the control of the diet, which would then have produced the same chemicals. And thus, the mechanism could then be manufactured into similar hallucinations, which would not directly be understood by the insect which is manufacturing it, merely controlling the mechanism of puppeteering all of the strings. And to the extent that they're puppeteering all of the strings, it doesn't see the hallucination. It doesn't know what its victims are seeing. It just knows that it's working. To this extent, the function of uh, what demons look like in reality is a farce on its face and highly evolving according to the function of each of the victims, as they would not perceive anything as they are an illusion, and thus the existence of the function of that illusion would not reflect in a mirror which has to reflect light, which is highly subverted by the existence of the darkness entities. And to that extent, you being able to create an artificial light that doesn't injure them generates the function of non reflection into the function that you are able to engage in a more severe light, such as the sun, would dissolve them entirely, as they do not actually have a material body to cast a shadow or reflection, as that would then have systems of chemical reactions specific to it, facilitating their predatory nature at night, which then could be manufactured into its own series of subcultures in order to preserve this function, and their ability to communicate through those mechanisms would then start to engage in the function of deals with the devil and the rest of that, which then would allow them to start to take over each of the societies in question, manufacturing their livestock. At which point, the function would then be subverted by the existence of a hazmat suit, which would stop the biology from being digested or filtered out, and thus prevents the hallucination from the first place. And thus, the action of each of these functions becomes each person's individual delusion. And thus, the action of compliance with the individual delusion means that they are perpetually missing the material threat, which feeds off of their lack of investigating skills, and thus tolerating its existence by refusing to investigate it perpetuates the existence of the threat against the community. Thus, the action of enemy combatants to the United States gaining control of those structures allows for the military function, which has already been sold to uh, proposed threats under false flags and sales, or rights to engage in the function of wars against those parties, which would no longer be defended by the majority, and thus the American military would specifically not defend the United States, as it has been compromised and systemically replaced by the KKK engaged in its wizard councils, mysteriously functioning from on high as their superior function, which is specifically referred to according to the prohibited functions inside the Bible about the use of wizardry, and thus the stories historically about the destructive nature of the wizard's function doing these activities, um, historically, not just in the Bible, but in generic folklore, would then systematically be reproduced for this function, facilitating the amplification of selling the country out, which is treason, and thus the act of defending it is an act of treason, and thus all subordinate functions requires the arrest of anyone who would bar a remedy to a secret, as they are actively participating in the use of their position as a weapon of war against the American government to militarily overthrow it. Take, for instance, the function of creating the illusion for the Hegelian dialectic, which manufactures the problem they wish to solve, which compels them to remove all other solutions except the one that they had prearranged for their RICO scam. To this extent, you generate the perpetuation of the opposite of everything that they want, which facilitates the proof of whatever they were stating that they're against. And thus, it becomes undeniable by virtue of the hyperexacerbation which is generated on purpose for the reaction. And thus, the reaction is their action. And to manufacture their reaction, they have to systemically control each and every aspect of what is happening. So they generate the superior powers of control, which becomes the infection itself. And to this extent, the function of exponential promotion of law enforcement powers, or military powers, or intelligence powers, or subversions trading liberty for security makes the security the threat, as the capacity is itself the weapon which creates an infinite extortion racket. And to that end, any exponential expansion of that function would itself be considered an act of lawfare, which is the use or misuse of law in order to engage in war, which then would be an attempt to overthrow the established authority as insurrection. To that end, you generate the militant functions of fraud, compromising the government functions to capture its equipment against the restrictions of its legitimacy, to engage in the complete overthrow of the constitutional republics, or other functions, which is formal treason. Aiding and giving comfort to those who do so is an act of treason. And the expansion of those functions, which are then protected for the delusion, is an act of treason. They are enemies of the United States and of its allies, and to this extent generate an obligation for everyone who is contracted to the defense of the United States national security, such as allies in war, are obligated to leverage their military equipment in favor of its opposition as a matter of international law or superior law, according to the treaty, which is a superior law function. It is above all customs, it is above all policies, it is above inferior law. It is not something that their arbitrary nonsense has authority to subvert, and to that end immediately trumps it. To that function which you support against the authority of the legitimacy of the collective government function is an undermining of the government function and is therefore not an activity of the function you are parasitically undermining in the situation where you would support any of those activities. So, to that end, in the example, if you're a white supremacist trying to justify the inferiority of the Latinos, you would hyper-accelerate the function of immigration as a problem, requiring it to be hyper-exacerbated so that it, in the function of creating the problem by virtue of quantity, is mismanaged into the inevitability of it being a proof solid of whatever thing that you're trying to push. To that end, it then becomes justifiable to support those hyper extremist positions generated by the hyper extremist vulnerability, hyper exploited as a phantom cell function, strategically engaging in the overburdening of the system, which is not the example in the fair market examination, which would not have those vulnerabilities which are generated by the double agents creating the subversion. And to that end, you generate the justification of the extremists. So, if you, in another example, are supporters of police abuses and excessive activities, or of the intelligence or military, whatever, then you would engage in these criminal subversions by the collapse of the police forces to make sure that they, in their Confederate patrol activities, are protected in their extremist function against the function of law enforcement, which would disqualify their illegitimate activities, which undermine the function by defrauding the courts, etc. Now, to that extent, you specifically support the function of law enforcement when you arrest the Confederates on patrol, and you disqualify them from the function of the court, and thus at the action of protecting it and its pollution of the courts by fraud against the courts for contempt of court by those participating who would otherwise have been considered disqualified or a hampering towards the function of law enforcement in the pursuit of the examination of the investigation in preparations for the function of the court. You then engage in the activity of the hyperexacerbation of the crimes themselves without any law enforcement, and thus the extortion for the racketeering activity becomes no law enforcement as an extortion to engage in permission for the criminal activities of the Confederate slave raids and other criminal subversions, such as their KKK contracts for the active maintaining of hate crimes throughout the system in order to engage in their objective of undermining the constitutional republic, which strictly prohibits their voter fraud, which is maintained by these powers, which they claim are non reviewable or appealable by the courts, which by definition they would seek to compromise and prevent any American courts from being able to produce credible opposition, as the old saying, such as from Jefferson, says, "You have made your position, now you can enforce it." And thus the argument being that the executive is unwilling to enforce the court order or enforce the legislative order, which specifically undermines their goal as an insurrectionist, then proves the impeachable offense on their behalf, which requires the function of the impeachment or the purging of them from the executive function, and to this end they generate their terrorist positions for the intimidation in order to engage in the function of sedition, which blocks the activities that they would otherwise be capable of doing, which would facilitate the checks and balances amongst the position because it postures a threat against their temporary preferences in favor of compromising the permanent. And to this end, you have the formalizing of insurrection by delusion. And in this action, you actively have their justifications of those undermining functions, such as the strictly prohibited activities by the Constitution, which is targeted militarily to be overthrown as to be completely nullified, so that at no point there could be anything except for the white supremacist state. And to the end that is an exclusively white supremacist state, uh, they take everything prescribed in the Constitution as the limitations and justifications and legalities of every form of thing, and they specifically violate it as an act of war against it, so that it can be overthrown, strictly prohibited by their oath of office, which has qualified their access to the equipment that they are leveraging in war against it, as they are terrorist insurgents without a legal government known as the Confederacy. Thus, they have the mechanisms as an obligation of their strategy for criminal censorship, which creates the function of their editing for the rewriting of history when they frame people or engage in their political espionage or economic espionage or other hate crime functions. To that end, the function of their capacity to engage in secret weapon activities subverts the public position from the Supreme Court about the use of weapons, and that is the equipment that is capable of being used by the public is the limitation on exclusively the equipment that could be used on the public. Therefore, according to that definition by the Second Amendment from SCOTUS, the activity of their secrecy is the unlimited activity of the capacity to all weapons as long as it is labeled secret, which is the function of it being available and not specifically stated as a thing that can be published, which can be, by definition, anything. So if they take a United States Abrams tank and they put it on the streets and they criminalize all recording of the Abrams tank, they can use it to blow up someone in a hot pursuit by virtue of having labeled it a secret. Now, everyone is allowed to see it who has access to see it, and thus everyone who records it is in specific violation of the secret. And thus the activity of having labeled it such is a matter of paperwork as opposed to any material valid excuse. And has made it unlimited in its application. Now, to the extent that that becomes obvious and delusional, their use of surveillance equipment for the same activities, for their mass people subversions or non-lethal equipment, which can be used against entire groups or against targeted individuals for various reasons, fraudulent and non-fraudulent, is captured by the fraudulent double agents who engage in the use of it by criminal extortions for its criminal purpose, specifically undermining the function of their office which qualify their access to it. And to that end, they have the capacity to engage in their various hate crimes by virtue of their access to the equipment, giving them latitude in their clan activities or their hate group activities, depending upon the specific faction of the Confederacy they are leveraging in favor of as they engage in the Druid insurrection against the United States. The purging of each party, American and alternative faction to the Confederacy, is a function in communism which facilitates the hyper-exacerbation for their loyalty to the party, and to that end, the eradication of all competitors and the extermination of the radicals upon maturity. When the radicals are no longer useful, they then become subversive dangers and must be eliminated themselves, becomes the natural tendency towards their status quo function as a collective concept on their intellectual pursuit towards domination of their arbitrary definitions when enforcing their particular policies in pursuit of their particular goals, which is again infinitely diversifiable and applicable by their phantom selves and mechanisms of plausible deniability as a mechanism of war in their espionage war against the United States, in their terrorist coup by superior artificial warfare, or the mechanism withstanding, considered to be a modern warfare tactic, and the hyper-exacerbation of these tactics supercompound with the messing with the enemy functions, which generates the infinite powers derivative by the hyper-restrained, which in the position of their abuses in the capacity for interrogation has historically been viewed as disqualifying, and these extremist positions generate the inability for the parties to oppose them outside of those that have specifically trained or are naturally competent against it, and thus the masses are extremely vulnerable, increasing their potential power infinitum without remedy.